often that all came across as just insincere and self-serving. The dialogue was not good. I am simply too dumb for this. It's every reader's nightmare. Marking a book, did not finish, commonly referred to as the dreaded DNF. We readers go into a new book with an open mind, hoping for the best, and often we're quite forgiving. We tend to give authors ample time to impress us and show us what they've got. But sometimes it just doesn't happen. One of my reading goals this year was to allow myself to stop reading books I'm not enjoying. I used to flat out refuse to DNF books because I did not want to be a quitter, and I would hold out hope till the bitter end that the book would become good. Well, guess who wasted a lot of valuable reading time? Although DNFing a book is inevitably disappointing, at least it does give us the opportunity to reflect on a book's weaknesses, which I think is just as valuable a skill as articulating a book's strengths. I'm pretty much done with my reading for the year. I'm just working on a few longer books, so it's unlikely I'm going to pick anything else up and then DNF it. So I thought we'd go through all the books I couldn't finish in 2024 and analyze what wasn't working. But first things first, how do you know when it's time to DNF a book? I've noticed one clear indicator that leaves me with no doubt that DNFing a book is the right choice. If I'm about to sit down with a book and I find myself thinking, I really don't want to read this, then it's time. It's one thing to not really feel in the mood for a particular book one day. It's another thing entirely to loathe the very idea of continuing with the book at all. And that's how these books were for me. So I'm just going to go in chronological order, starting in January with The Coming Wave, Technology, Power, and the 21st Century's Greatest Dilemma by Mustafa Suleyman. This 2023 nonfiction book outlines how artificial intelligence is going to revolutionize technology and society in the coming decades and imagines what kind of future it might create. Essentially, AI could be the best thing that ever happened to humanity, or the worst. Truth be told, my main reason for DNFing this is that it just gave me too much anxiety. I just do not have it in me right now to hear about how AI could potentially bring about the apocalypse if handled incorrectly, and how it's being handled incorrectly. But more importantly, the author's positioning of himself rubbed me the wrong way. Suleyman was a co-founder of the AI company called DeepMind, which has since been acquired by Google, and he's now the CEO of Microsoft AI, so his whole career has been dedicated to improving and expanding AI. And for that reason, at many points throughout the book, it sounded like Suleyman was speaking out both sides of his mouth, like he wanted to hedge his bets. He imagines two tracks to the future of AI, one in which it saves humanity and another one in which it destroys humanity. And it actually is kind of positioned in those dramatic terms, but either way, Suleyman will be able to say he was right. Like, if we end up seeing many benefits from AI, well then he can take credit for helping to develop and improve it, but then if we end up seeing a lot of harm from AI, well, he can also say that he tried to warn us. And often that all came across as just insincere and self-serving. I did initially pick up this particular book because the author had first-hand experience with AI. I thought that would help me understand the process better, and to some extent it did. But once I got to about 60% of the way through, I realized that if I want to read about AI and its potentials, I'd probably rather read from an author who takes one perspective and argues for it and sticks to it, rather than one who's trying to play for all the teams. Then my next DNF in February was The Librarianist by Patrick DeWitt. The novel follows a retired librarian named Bob Comet as he volunteers at a retirement home in the hopes of filling a loneliness in his life. And that's pretty much the plot. It's definitely much more a character study, character-driven novel than a plot-driven novel. Of all the books on today's list, I think this one is the one I have the least to say about, because it just couldn't grab my attention. And I'm still having trouble identifying exactly why. Although the characters are pretty endearing, I found the pace very slow, in a way that dragged, rather than was a slow or a measured building up to something. Plus, I got about 40% of the way through the book, and by that time I still hadn't figured out, where was the conflict in this story? Where was the tension? Where was the story exactly? This was actually surprising to me because I typically enjoy character-driven novels that tend to be on the slower, subtler, more introspective side, but this, I just don't think it had enough forward motion. Like, you do need at least a little bit of a driving force to create a story. And for that reason, I kept waiting for the thing that would get me invested, and it just never came. In fact, I stopped reading right after the one big reveal of the book came, and even that wasn't enough to hook me back in. I felt I really didn't care that much about it once we got there. Although that said, if the story had ended there and it was revised a bit, I actually think it would be a solid short story, but in its published form, I was just waiting for it to be over. Which is a pretty good sign that maybe you should stop reading if you just want it to be over. I ended up looking into some Goodreads reviews of this book, and I found it interesting that several reviews of people who say that they're fans of DeWitt's work agree that this is his weakest novel. I am still interested in reading more of his work. I believe he has one novel called The Sisters Brothers that's like a comic western that sounds kind of like it could be fun, but this one was just not it for me. How We Named the Stars by Andres Ordorica. In this new release and debut novel, first-generation college freshman Daniel de la Luna finds himself drawn to his roommate Sam. Just as their relationship is beginning to develop into something intimate, tragedy strikes, and Daniel must learn to cope with profound grief while reconnecting with his ancestors in Mexico. I really wanted to like this, especially a debut novel from a queer author. I tried to give it the best chances I could, until I just couldn't anymore. Unfortunately, the problem was pretty much entirely the writing style as opposed to the plot. So the novel is written in epistolary form, and Daniel is writing letters to Sam, and I think this was the wrong choice. Epistolary style is hard, because you can either make a reader feel more immersed in the story because of that second-person you, or the very same thing can make a reader feel more distant and excluded from the story, and that you don't want. In this case, because Daniel is reflecting on his memories in these letters to Sam, I found a lot of the plot and the action happened off the page, off the screen, and that did make me feel removed from the story, like as if the real development wasn't important enough to be shown. Plus, because of the recounting and the reminiscing, that letter form did a lot of telling instead of showing, where it really mattered, especially in regard to the characterization. And don't get me wrong, some amount of telling is absolutely necessary in every novel, short story, fiction in general. But when it comes to getting to know our characters, we want to see them act and behave and then get to know who they are by making our own judgments and inferences, not be told how a character is. One really obvious example of this for me was pretty early on in the book. It's when Daniel is recalling the time that he was talking to his high school counselor about college admissions, and she tells him, oh, of course you should apply to these Ivy League schools because you're so brilliant, you read all of these books. But then we never actually see Daniel reading all these big books and doing brilliant things. We're just asked to take this other character's word that is true when we don't actually have evidence that it is. And that doesn't mean it's not true to his character, but I want to see it happening rather than be told that it happens and then just never see it. And then on top of all that, the dialogue. The dialogue was not good, very stiff and unrealistic. Really nothing like anything I've heard an 18-year-old boy say before. Not that I talk to a lot of 18-year-old boys, but I'm pretty sure this is not what they sound like. All of that together just created a situation where I couldn't not notice the writing and what I would have done to edit it, and I just couldn't enjoy the reading experience. It just was so glaring what could have been improved. The premise, however, is pretty good. It's not anything new or novel, but still definitely worth reading. And I think it could have been potentially a lovely story about the complications of identity and family history. It's just that the text itself needed another round or two of revision. I believe Ordorica started in poetry, if I'm not mistaken, and I do hope he continues writing novels, but I also hope maybe he gets a new editor. But real quick, if you're enjoying this video so far and would like to see more videos like it, do consider hitting that subscribe button. This is Thought Couture, I'm Kelsey Jo, and I publish new videos just about every week on book recommendations, reviews, creative writing content, and literary chats like this. And now for something completely different, 7 Brief Lessons in Physics by Carlo Rovelli. In 7 chapters, physicist Rovelli aims to introduce beginners to the study of physics, including gravity, black holes, and the theory of relativity. So what went wrong here? In short, I am simply too dumb for this. I would like to have a basic understanding of physics, because I have an interest in exploring the nature of reality, because that's a very normal interest to have, and I read some books on metaphysics, but I feel like that understanding of physics, the science portion, is lacking. And from the description, this seemed like the perfect place to start getting that. I'm really not at all surprised I had trouble with this one. My brain does not do well with mathematical and scientific thinking, those things that matter, because I just don't process these concepts easily. They just seem so abstract and unreal to me, which is why I am an English major with a reading channel, and I do better with the more philosophical thinking, like the metaphysics. So the trouble with this book is largely a me issue and not really the author's. My main mistake was thinking brief meant simple. It does not. And maybe these lessons are simple for someone who's had more science education than I had. I took exactly one science class in college, and it was biology. Otherwise, I really haven't studied it since high school. And I'm gonna need like a baby's first book of physics. Like, I need one of those board books that you flip with like the soft covers, or else I really don't know how I'm gonna wrap my head around all this. That said, this book does seem to be marketed as like physics for the layman, and I'm just not sure if that's accurate. Now, Rovelli clearly knows what he's talking about, and he does do his best to be approachable. He also includes a fair amount of references to like art and music to reach out to an audience that probably prefers the arts over the sciences. But if you're starting with zero knowledge of physics like I am, this might not be the best introduction for you. Though unfortunately, I'm not sure what would be, so I'm gonna have to do some more exploration on that. Hello again. So I film like in a basement, and it is way too cold, so don't mind my blanket wrap thing that looks like I should be a tour guide at Santa's workshop. Anyway, next up we have The State We're In, Main Stories by Beattie. As the title suggests, every story in this collection is set in Maine, and that's about the best summary I can give you because these stories were not very good. This was my most disappointing DNF of 2024 because Beattie has been hailed for decades as a master of the short story form, and I've been starting to write short stories myself lately, so I thought she would be a good teacher. And that's not untrue, but this collection in particular does not show off her skills and her strengths at all. The State We're In is one of her more recent collections. I believe this was published in 2016, so it's not the one that put her on the literary map. But it is the collection that my library happened to have at the time that I was there, which is why I got it. But starting with a recent collection I do think was a mistake. In addition to being set in Maine, all of these stories follow female protagonists, and they're in the slice of life realist style. All of the stories capture ordinary moments in these characters' lives. And the big problem with these stories is that they all just ended way too soon. Often at the point where I thought the story was really just starting and picking up is when it just ended. I excused this the first time it happened. In any short story collection, not all of them are going to be winners. I wasn't too concerned about it at first. But then as I kept reading and every story was ending abruptly and in a totally unsatisfying way, that's when I just got fed up. got fed up and said I couldn't do it anymore. Some of the stories definitely had potential. The one that I liked the most was one where the character, the protagonist, is at a party and she's talking about her aunt who is hiding her cancer diagnosis. And that I thought was really interesting. I wanted more of these characters. I wanted more kind of revelation about this dynamic, and then just never got it. There was also one, I think, like novella-length story that was split up and interspersed throughout the collection following the same teenage girl. And I kind of liked that idea of splitting up a story and returning to the same protagonist and seeing how she develops and kind of, compares and contrasts to the rest of the story. And it seemed like maybe something kind of interesting was maybe going to happen to her, but I just couldn't get through the other stories enough to care about her story and to power my way through. Also, you would think, given the title, that there'd be more exploration of life in Maine, and that the place would have more of a presence, but there wasn't, and it didn't. In fact, the setting seemed mostly incidental, like this could have taken place anywhere, and seemed like Beattie just kind of chose Maine because she felt like it. It didn't feel like Maine itself had any real importance. All of that combined, unfortunately, the collection was just a disappointing slog to get through, and I did not get through it. Now, I'm most certainly not giving up on Ann Beattie yet. I have no doubt that she's been highly praised for a reason, but I should have started with her earlier, more highly praised work. As a final little note on this one, a book is bad if even the New York Times review is critical of it. They're trying to sell books and often put books in a more forgiving light for that reason, but this one is pretty lukewarm, so that's not a good sign. And finally, my most recent DNF of the year, The Palace of Eros by Caro de Robertis. So this is a sapphic retelling of the Greek myth of Psyche and Eros. After she's been outcast by her village, the young Psyche yearns for a life away from the prying eyes of men. The goddess Eros has been sent by Aphrodite to kill Psyche, but instead she instantly falls in love with her and sweeps her away to her palace where they are lovers in secret. Much like How We Named the Stars earlier, I so wanted to love this. This was my first time reading a myth retelling, and in general, I'm not really sure if that's the genre, the subgenre for me, but either way, this I don't think was a very good introduction to it, unfortunately. And once again, like How We Named the Stars, it was an issue of the writing style really putting a damper on an otherwise solid premise. So my chief issue was that I found the prose overwrought. It was almost as if the author was trying to match the tone of what they thought a myth retelling should sound like. I'm not familiar with the rest of Robertis' novels, but I'm curious to know if they all read like this, because it didn't come across as natural. There was just this quality of trying too hard. Now, I have no problem at all with highly wrought prose. In fact, I prefer it and I love it, but there is a difference between highly wrought and overwrought. In the latter, these sentences or the paragraphs might sound pretty, and therefore they might be interpreted as profound, but when you look more closely, they're not really saying anything that's moving the story or the characters along. So here's one sentence that stuck out to me in particular that demonstrates what I mean. I longed for so much that I almost longed for everything, which is a feeling so vast it curves in on itself toward the start of the circle, where everything becomes nothing, and the longing for everything blurs into longing for nothing, a subsuming in the longing itself, pure, raw, swallowing you whole. You can probably hear from that this sentence has a quality of talking in circles, and there's a lot of repetition that is redundant. To be specific, a feeling so vast it curves in on itself toward the start of the circle. Well, curving in on itself implies a curving toward the start of the circle or the start of the thing. Also, where everything becomes nothing, and the longing for everything blurs into the longing for nothing. Is it just me, or are those clauses saying essentially the same thing? Again, I love a long and convoluted sentence, but only when it is so finely tuned and well crafted that it doesn't call attention to itself. If you've been here a minute, then you know how much I love Virginia Woolf, and she is known for her very long, very wordy sentences. But if you're familiar with her work, imagine a Woolf sentence in comparison to this sentence. In Woolf, you really don't notice until after you've finished reading. You look back and think, wow, that was only one sentence. Because while you're reading, you're swept up in the motion of the sentence and the imagery and where her thought process is leading you. Whereas here, you're reading the sentence and thinking, oh, dear God, this is all one sentence. In a super long Wolf sentence, I feel like we're led somewhere new. Whereas here, there's the sense of like circling the drain. And also, that sentence was one of the shorter ones. Others were like half a page long. And again, much like how we named the stars, I was reading and I just couldn't not notice how I would have fixed those passages.
Just to clarify real quick, Robertis is not at all a bad writer by any means. There are plenty of well-written, very beautiful moments in this book of what I read of it. However, the problem is more that so much of the language here is so rich and ornate in that way that feels almost like it's trying too hard to be something that and much of it starts to read as thick and kind of suffocating, where I could only read a few pages at a time before I started feeling exhausted. Also, for a great example of a very long sentence that works, look at the first sentence of Wolf's essay on being ill. It is utterly fantastic, and you can see how each part of this sentence flows logically and moves to somewhere new and says something different. It's brilliant.
My other issue with The Palace of Eros was that it felt a lot like a young adult novel. It definitely isn't YA though. There are many intimate scenes that go far beyond of what would be appropriate for that 13 to 17 age range. It was pretty clearly written with an adult audience in mind. But the young characters, I think Psyche's maybe in her late teens, early 20s. I didn't get the sense that she was older than like 21 maybe. In combination with the themes of coming of age, of discovering your identity, it just felt like it was something that would appeal to younger readers. And that's not to say that novels that are coming of age stories can't appeal to adult audiences, because of course that's not true. There are many classics that prove otherwise. The one that's coming to mind right now is Great Expectations, The Catcher in the Rye, To Kill a Mockingbird. Those all appeal to adult readers as well, even though their characters are younger. But somehow, The Palace of Eros was just not speaking to me as an adult. And even like the cover, it's kind of cartoony and young. And of course, to be perfectly clear, there's nothing wrong with YA literature and appealing to a young audience. It's just that I don't fall into that demographic, and it's just not what I'm looking for. So I'm not positive if I'm going to continue reading in the mythological retelling subgenre. Generally, it's not really something that draws me in. However, I do think I will explore some of Madeline Miller's work. I've heard she's like the gold standard for retellings. And because I did just read the Iliad a couple months ago, as I've mentioned like multiple times recently, I am curious to know what she does with that in the Song of Achilles. But as far as the Palace of Eros is concerned, unfortunately, it did make me a bit more skeptical about retellings. And unfortunately, I wish I did not start with that one. Well, out of these 69 books I picked up this year, these were the 6 that I simply could not finish. That is a DNF rate of about 8.7%, which is not too bad. I'm happy with that. However, I do think I'm going to keep up with this goal of forming the habit of DNFing when I really want to in 2025, because if I'm being honest with myself, there were several books that I did finish this year that I probably should not have. So now I am curious, how often do you DNF? Are you a serial DNFer, just shutting these books left and right? Or are you someone who, on principle, refuses to do so, and you will fight through to the bitter end? Reminder, you can also follow me on Instagram, Threads, and Goodreads, where I post some fun bookish extras and some more full-length reviews. And also, I'm considering joining Blue Sky. I hear that's all the rage these days, where all the cool kids are, and I may end up replacing Threads with that. I will let you know if any of that changes. If you enjoyed this video, I think you'll also enjoy this one. And as always, thank you so very much for spending your time with me today. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one.